Welcome back to another edition of Between Two FARS. I'm Warneke Miller here once again with Michael Mark, who has been helping us a lot to understand cost principles. And today we're going to continue our earlier discussion about cost and accounting for those costs. Because once you know what your costs are, you got to figure out how you're tracking them. So Michael, can you just help us understand where we even begin on this?
Okay, well, we're getting into some fairly arcane stuff, and I don't want to make this more complex than it has to be because, you know, there are people who do this for a living like auditors and pricers, and you need to rely on those when you're dealing with cost type contracts. But you need to understand a little bit about it. So I've talked about costs have to be reasonable, allowable, and allocable. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, and particularly allocability. If you're doing a cost type contract, the contractor has to be able to track its costs. You know, it has to be able to say, okay, we're paying the cost of the work done under this contract. Well, what work did you do? How much labor did you expend? Do you have an accounting system that will track those costs? So the first thing they have to show us is that they have an accounting system that is adequate to do this. And the government has to approve that system. Now, for a small company—
Is that the disclosure statement that we talk about at the beginning of our FAR Part 9 responsibility determination?
Well, it may be a disclosure statement. I'm used to seeing that in the context of the cost accounting standards. And there's a disclosure statement that talks about, here's how my accounting system works. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But just general cost accounting, a small company is not covered by CAS. You have to have, there's a threshold, it's about 50 million for modified coverage, and it's much higher for the full coverage. And it may even be higher than 50 million. I think they've increased it, so I may be wrong on that right now. So I have to have a system, and there are commercially available systems. I've heard of Delex is one, and companies will buy these systems and configure them. They'll put in their accounting codes, and our people will look at them and like DCMA and say, okay, that was adequate to track the cost, and we approve it. For a large company, they have often homegrown systems or very highly modified commercial systems to track costs at a very high level of detail. And that's the companies that have the cost accounting standards requirements as well. There's a difference between cost accounting standards and cost principles. Cost accounting standards simply say, here is a way you track your costs. How are you going to account for them? And it talks in general principles about a number of them. It talks how to track your labor. An important one is CAS 405, tracking for unallowable costs, and you have to account for them because you're incurring them. So you need to know what they are so that you don't bill us. Another one is there's a cost principle for accounting for post-retirement benefits, pensions and whatnot. Companies will often get rid of their pension plans, which are funded in part by the government. So when that happens, they have to account for all of the bill that's in that pension plan. And if the pension plan ran a surplus, the government's going to say, well, we're owed some portion of that surplus based on our pro rata input. And if there's a deficit, the company's going to come after us and say, oh, you owe us more money. And there's lots and lots of litigation on this. And let me tell you, the accounting for that is really arcane. So first, you have to have a system to account for your costs. And then you have to be able to track all of those costs. And that's where you get into the cost principles, because as I said, some things are allowable and some things are not allowable. And others are allowable under certain circumstances, but not allowable under other circumstances. So without that system in place, you can't do this. Another thing is when we are doing our analysis to determine whether the cost proposed is fair and reasonable, we need to understand how those costs are being incurred. How much are you paying for labor? How much is your overhead? Are those rates reasonable? And in addition, in fixed price contracts, typically we don't worry about costs. However, the FAR specifically says in Part 31 that if you use cost analysis to determine whether a price is fair and reasonable, and we talked about the difference between cost and price, but if you're going to use cost analysis, then the cost principles apply to that analysis and to the contract. And we see that in NASA, particularly in a number of, like STED does these broad agency announcements, and they're awarding fixed price contracts. But very often those announcements say we're going to do cost analysis to determine whether the prices you're offering are fair and reasonable. Well, guess what? We just dragged the cost principles into that contract. And that causes a lot of problems. It causes problems with things like cost sharing. What costs can a company use from its account to share those costs? And so you need to be aware of those things. The FAR Part 31, it lays out all of the costs that are allowable and not allowable fairly clearly, although some of the discussions are very long and some can be very arcane, but you need to be at least aware that they exist. And talk to your pricers. They're the ones who really understand this stuff and deal with it on a day-to-day basis. And I'm sure you've got contracting officers at each center who have spent most of their time doing cost type contracting. So they're very familiar and comfortable with the process, and they can help educate you in understanding that. So these are important things before you start delving into whether a cost is an allowable cost or an unallowable cost. And we can talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it's very important to use your network and reach out to your pricers and to other contracting officers, because NASA does do a lot of cost contracting. So we've got a wealth of resources here, and this area gets complicated very quickly. So I'm very glad that we do have experts on hand who can sort of guide us through all of this. But I'm really glad that you're able to give us this overview and give us a chance to get started in this very technical area of contracting. Why don't we come back again next time and talk a little bit more about these costs?
Okay.
All right, join us again next time between two FARs.